You found out that you're entitled to an inheritance. Maybe your great aunt left you a few dollars in her will. Or maybe your parents have died and you're coming into a significant sum of money. The big question is, what should you do with that inheritance? I'm Andrew Ayers. I'm a lawyer who works with families and business owners to protect their legacies through planning. In the next few minutes, we're going to talk about the importance of treating your inheritance from your family and making sure you have a plan for that money. Now, everybody has their own story when it comes to an inheritance, or maybe you've seen something in the papers, some story that seems astronomical. It seems crazy about someone inheriting millions of dollars and having a life-changing event. And while that's lovely, the fact is most people won't inherit millions of dollars, but will at some point inherit some property. And the question is, what should you be doing with that property? The first thing you need to know is that an inheritance is considered your separate property if you are married. Now, years ago, I began my career doing family law in New York City. One of the more common issues we would run into is what happens if one spouse inherits money? Is it joint property that both spouses are entitled to, or is it separate property? It's important because if it's separate property and you go through a divorce, you get to keep all of that money. However, if it's considered joint property, then your spouse gets to split it with you. And if you're going through a divorce, chances are you don't want to split your inheritance from your family with your spouse. So what happens is if you receive the money from your inheritance and you just take that check and put it in your joint checking account with your spouse, that's called commingling. Commingling means we've mixed it together and we've now made it a joint asset. Even if like a week or two later you take that money out and put it into a separate account, it can still be treated as joint property by a court. I had a case years ago where the money was put into the joint account. The parties spent some of it, did some other things for a couple of weeks, and then another 2 weeks went on, and then there were some paychecks that went in, and some other money went in, and then eventually some, but not all of that inheritance was transferred out to a separate account. My client, who had had the inheritance, made the claim that all of that money, his inheritance, was separate property. His wife, however, said, wait a second, that money was sitting in our joint checking account for weeks before it was transferred out. It became our money and we're entitled to share it. Now the judge looked at the basic bank account statements and actually saw that even though money was replenished, at times most of the inheritance had been spent through the joint checking account, just from going out to dinner, buying groceries, things like that. And the judge said that in fact it was joint property, and my client had to then give half of that inheritance money to his wife. So if you're going to be inheriting money, one of the first things you may want to do is talk to your spouse about it. You love them. Hopefully you're not going through a divorce at the time, but you may still want to make sure that that money is kept separate. So when you inherit the money, when that check is cut to you, you can open a separate bank account and keep the money in that separate bank account. If you're even more concerned about it, some things I've worked with my clients have been a postnuptial agreement that actually says that this inheritance is now going to be treated as separate, and we identify it and we go through all of the parties' assets. So maybe even a postnuptial agreement is the way to go if you're inheriting especially a large sum of money from your family. So you need to know about this, because if you get that check and you just absentmindedly take out your phone and deposit it into your joint checking account, you may have just turned your inheritance into a joint asset. So there's kind of two ways to approach this. You can just try to do it yourself and figure it won't be a big deal. Or more importantly, you can work with professionals to make sure that if that inheritance check is coming to you and you want to keep that separate, you want to keep a family legacy separate, maybe pass it on to your to your parents' grandkids, or pass it on to your grandkids, or even pass it on to nieces and nephews or cousins in your family, work with professionals, work with an accountant, work with a lawyer, work with a financial planner to make sure that money is kept separate. And if you're ready to get started, you can go to andrewmayers.com and click on the Schedule a Consultation button. That will take you directly to my personal calendar, and we can set up a legal strategy session. It's your inheritance. It should be your separate property. If you want to make it joint, that's fine. But if you want to keep it separate, make sure you take the correct steps to protect your inheritance.